1844, Georgia. Christmas Eve arrived at the Harrison plantation, but for the enslaved it was not a holiday. It was another day branded with labor, hunger, and humiliation. While church bells rang across the distant town and hymns floated through cold winter air, inside the great house the Harrisons lit their candles, filled their glasses, and congratulated themselves on wealth purchased in blood. The plantation stretched for miles, rows of cotton fields brittle with frost, their stalks broken and sharp as bones. The cabins where the enslaved lived were low huts of wood and mud, barely standing against the December wind. Smoke rose thin from their chimneys, weak fires struggling against the cold. Children shivered on pallets of straw, their stomachs hollow. Women returned late from the fields with backs bent and hands cracked, while men staggered under the weight of work that never ended. There was no feast waiting for them, only scraps, if scraps remained. But the big house shone like a beacon of cruelty. Evergreen garlands wound across its pillars. Pine and holly dressed the mantel. A long oak table gleamed under candlelight, set with porcelain and silver polished, until it mirrored the guests' laughter back at them. The Harrisons prided themselves on being hosts masters of Christian celebration, leaders of Southern society. They praised God for their fortunes and spoke of charity, even as their slaves were ordered to stand in the shadows and watch. Among those shadows was Abigail. She was 19, thin but strong, her skin scarred in places where whips had once spoken, her eyes darker still, where humiliation had carved its mark. She had lived on the plantation since birth, though she had no memory of her parents, both sold before she could speak their names. Raised among cruelty, she learned early to hide her anger, to bow her head, to keep her voice low. Yet inside her memory, every insult remained alive, pressed down like embers that smoldered but never died. That night the Harrisons dressed her not in shoes or proper clothes, but in a thin muslin gown already fraying at the hem. She was summoned into the dining hall barefoot, the stone floor biting her skin with its cold. The mistress's children, flushed from sweet wine and roast meat, tossed bread crusts at her as if she were a stray dog. They laughed, clapped, and pointed when she bent her head to avoid the blows. Their laughter echoed in the vaulted room, joining with the fiddles and the clinking of glasses. The mistress herself, a woman known in town for her sharp tongue and airs of refinement, once poured a bowl of soured milk over Abigail's head in front of other slaves. She did it not out of anger, but for amusement, to see Abigail's hair drip with curdled white, while others were forced to laugh. They must learn order, she declared. Even in jest, discipline teaches obedience. Her cruelty was a performance, staged daily before guests who nodded in agreement. The master's brand of mockery cut even deeper. He often summoned Abigail to stand at the edge of the room when punishments were carried out. He made her sing hymns, her voice trembling, while men screamed under the lash, or women were struck until they collapsed. To him her singing was entertainment, a grotesque harmony to suffering. "Lift your voice to the Lord," he would say, smiling, as the whip cracked against flesh. Each note that left her throat carried the weight of others' pain, twisted into spectacle. The Harrisons believed themselves benevolent. To their neighbors they spoke of Christian duty, of discipline tempered by kindness. They spoke of our people as though ownership was proof of care. Yet in truth, the Harrisons fed children the stale remains of dinners, denied shoes through winter, and forced mothers to scrub floors while their own infants wailed from hunger. At the oak table they dined on venison, goose, pies rich with sugar, while the enslaved bent over iron pots scraping what little grease remained. Christmas on the plantation was not a season of joy, but of sharper contrasts. In the quarters there were whispers of older traditions, songs hummed low, faint rhythms tapped into wood, the memory of African festivals that once marked midwinter. But those sounds were muffled, silenced beneath the weight of surveillance. The Harrisons allowed no dancing, no celebration that was not theirs to command. And so the enslaved kept their memories quiet, their grief pressed into silence. Abigail had endured 19 such Christmases, each one the same: forced labor, hollow stomach, humiliation dressed as festivity. But on this night, humiliation cut deeper. She had been made to stand for hours, hands clasped, while the guests of the Harrisons feasted. Every so often the mistress barked her name sharply, ordering her to fetch a jug of cider or adjust the hem of a guest's dress. She obeyed with steady hands, though the cold burned her feet raw against the stone. She dared not look up, for each glance was met with scorn. The children's games grew crueler as the night stretched on. They threw dried fruit pits at her, laughing when one struck her cheek. They demanded she balance a tray of empty plates on her head and march across the room like a circus act. When she faltered, their laughter roared. Their mother did not scold them, she applauded. Their father raised his glass and declared it a lesson in obedience. The guests chuckled, complicit in the spectacle. For Abigail, every second was carved into memory. She said nothing. She did not weep before them, but her silence was not submission. It was the silence of stone under pressure, the silence of earth before the storm. She carried within her the weight of every insult, every bowl of spoiled milk poured in mockery, every hymn forced through her lips while others bled. That night the Harrisons celebrated their wealth, their supposed virtue, their mastery. But in the corner of the room, barefoot and silent, Abigail stood like a shadow, her eyes fixed not on the children or the guests, but on something unseen. They thought she was broken. They thought humiliation had hollowed her into nothing. They did not see the ember smouldering behind her silence. They did not hear the storm already forming in her memory. Abigail's world had already been stripped of so much before the winter of 1844. She had no mother to guide her, no father to shield her. She had been raised by the hands of strangers, older women, who offered what comfort they could before being sold away themselves, men who whispered warnings in the dark before vanishing with chains on their wrists. The plantation was a revolving door of grief, and every absence carved itself into her memory. But the sharpest wound came with the death of her child. The baby was born on a humid summer night, in a cabin where air barely moved, and the cries of field hands still echoed from the day's labor. Abigail had been allowed no rest during her pregnancy. She bent over cotton rows until her stomach grew so heavy she could barely stand. The mistress dismissed her fatigue as laziness. The master joked that children came cheaper than mules. When Abigail finally delivered the child a boy, frail but breathing her joy was a flame quickly snuffed. He was made to sleep in the barn, not even in her arms. There was no cradle, no quilt, no mercy. The floor was bare dirt, covered with a thin rag, cold in winter, damp with insects in summer. Abigail begged for a proper pallet, but the mistress refused. "If he survives," she said with a shrug, "he'll be strong enough." But the baby did not survive. Fever came, thin cries grew weaker, breath slowed. By dawn his body was still. Abigail held him to her chest, rocking silently, while the overseer's voice outside demanded she return to work by midday. The earth swallowed him without ceremony, his grave unmarked, a mound of dirt no different from the fields tilled for cotton. No hymn was sung except the broken murmur Abigail whispered under her breath. She was given no time to mourn. By nightfall she was back in the big house, scrubbing the mistress's floors, while the mistress's own children laughed upstairs. The Harrisons spoke of their benevolence to neighbors. Mrs. Harrison boasted often that she was teaching the enslaved order, her words coated with the satisfaction of a woman convinced of her own virtue. Mr. Harrison claimed to treat his people with Christian kindness, speaking in town of his generosity. He recited scripture on Sundays, his voice solemn as he prayed for his family's fortune. But within the walls of their house, their kindness was a lie. They fed the enslaved nothing but leftovers, stale bread crusts, scraps of meat unfit for their own table. They clothed children in rags, while their own sons strutted in coats cut from imported cloth. Their hypocrisy was endless. At the long oak table, they praised God for abundance, while enslaved boys were whipped in the yard for stealing a single biscuit. They sang hymns about mercy, while forcing Abigail to polish their shoes until her fingers bled. Mrs. Harrison lectured guests about Christian duty, while her own household shivered barefoot in December frost. Every prayer was poisoned, every grace spoken with cruelty beneath it. Abigail knew it all. She lived it, she breathed it. Her body carried the marks of lashes, but her memory carried something heavier. The sound of her child coughing weakly in the night, the way his hand once curled around her finger, the sudden silence when he stopped breathing. The pain did not fade. It lived inside her, sharp and relentless, like a stone lodged beneath the skin. The Harrisons believed pain broke people. They thought humiliation could grind a soul into dust. And with most it did. Many bowed their heads until they could no longer lift them. Many sang when ordered, prayed when commanded, survived by making themselves small. But Abigail was different. She endured, but she did not surrender. Every insult was a weight she carried, but also a weapon she sharpened. Every loss was stored away, layered upon the last, forming a silence so deep it became a reservoir of strength. At night, when others slept, Abigail often lay awake on the cabin floor. She would stare at the roof beams, blackened by smoke, and let her memories march before her eyes. She remembered the spoiled milk dripping down her scalp, the laughter of the mistress's children, the hymns forced from her throat while blood stained the floorboards. She remembered her baby's final breath, and she remembered the words of the mistress. "We teach them order." Those words beat against her like a drum. In her silence, Abigail became a vessel of memory. She did not scream when insulted. She did not cry when mocked. She absorbed it all, storing it like seeds pressed into soil. To others, she appeared obedient, broken, docile. But inside, her silence was not empty. It was full of wounds, of humiliation, of love stolen too soon, of rage waiting for its season. Christmas only sharpened the cruelty. The Harrisons loved to boast that they allowed their slaves a holiday meal. But the meal was scraps gathered from the table after guests had eaten. The gnawed bones of roast goose, crusts of pie, the thick gristle of beef. The family dined on delicacies, drinking wine until their cheeks glowed, while Abigail and the others waited by the kitchen door for what remained. Sometimes nothing remained, and when the enslaved whispered among themselves that the feast was mockery, Mrs. Harrison scolded them. "Gratitude is all I ask." But Abigail knew gratitude was not what they wanted. They wanted silence. They wanted brokenness. They wanted the enslaved to accept pain as natural, humiliation as deserved. The loss of her child was meant to finish her, to crush the last piece of hope inside her. But it did not. Instead, it hollowed her out in a different way-making room for something else to take root. Her grief was no longer just sorrow. It was a mirror. Every time the mistress's children laughed, she saw her baby's still face. Every time the master demanded she sing, she heard the silence of the grave. Pain became remembrance, and remembrance became fuel. The Harrisons believed they had stripped her of everything, but in truth they had given her something they could not control, a memory sharper than any blade, heavier than any chain. And beneath that memory, something waited. Abigail learned to keep her face still, still when the mistress slapped her for scrubbing too slowly, still when the master called her to stand in the corner, watching while he punished others, her voice breaking into hymns under command. Still when the children mocked her, tossing crumbs as if feeding a chained animal. Stillness became her shield, the mask behind which her thoughts could grow unseen. But silence is never empty. It gathers, it deepens. And in Abigail it began to turn. In the kitchen she noticed things others ignored. The mistress favored milk warm in the morning, cool by afternoon, poured for her children before bed. It was their daily comfort, their symbol of abundance. To Abigail it became a vision of possibility. Milk spoiled easily, soured quickly, and its taste masked bitterness. What if sweetness could carry something sharper? What if what they craved most became the cup that betrayed them? On the plantation, herbs grew in hidden corners. Some were used for livestock, to heal swelling, to cure worms in cattle, or calm the stomachs of mules. But Abigail, observant and patient, knew another truth. What healed in small measure destroyed in large. She had seen animals collapse when given too much. She had seen leaves that soothed fever become dangerous when brewed too strong. Memory became her teacher, and she studied the line between medicine and death with quiet precision. She did not rush. Weeks passed. She bent to her duties as though nothing inside her had changed. She scrubbed the floors until they reflected candlelight. She polished the Harrison silver until her face stared back at her, blurred and warped. She served meals with lowered eyes, bowing slightly, her hands steady as ever. Outwardly, she was the same girl the Harrisons believed they had broken. Inwardly, she was assembling something the Harrisons could not see: resolve. Resolve grows slowly, like roots spreading unseen beneath soil. Hers was fed by grief, by humiliation, by the bitter memory of soured milk dripping from her head. She tended it carefully, never letting it show. She worked silently beside other enslaved women, listening as they whispered prayers for mercy. She nodded when spoken to, but she prayed to nothing. Mercy had never come. Only memory, only balance, only justice waiting like storm clouds. The mistress boasted often to her neighbors of the obedience she demanded. "Our people know their place," she said, sipping from a porcelain cup. Abigail stood behind her chair during those visits, listening. She did not blink when the mistress gestured toward her as proof. "See how silent she is. She is an example." They all nodded. None saw the fire banked behind Abigail's silence. The master, too, bragged of his Christian household. He told guests that discipline was kindness, that whipping was instruction, that feeding scraps was teaching thrift. He claimed his people were blessed to belong to such a family. But Abigail knew better. She saw the children cry themselves to sleep from hunger. She saw the scars on backs that had never healed. She felt the frost cut through thin rags while the master's family warmed themselves by the fire. Hypocrisy was their true scripture, and she memorized every verse. It was during one of those evenings that the plan finally sharpened in her mind. The mistress called for her cup of milk. Abigail carried it on a silver tray, the pitcher cool and gleaming in the candlelight. She watched the liquid pour smoothly into porcelain, watched the mistress drink greedily, watched her wipe her mouth and declare it fresh and sweet. None noticed Abigail's hands. None noticed how steady they had become. She knew then the milk would be the path. From that night onward, she gathered what she needed. While cleaning the yard, she plucked herbs left near the animal pens. While tending laundry, she slipped seeds from plants the others overlooked. She dried them in corners of the cabin where no one searched, grinding them into powder with stones while others slept. She measured with care, recalling the way livestock twitched and fell when given too much. Not enough, and suspicion would rise. Too much, and the wrong person might suffer. Precision was survival. Each day she returned to the big house as though nothing had changed. She carried coal to the fire, polished the mistress's jewelry, folded linens with neat corners. Each "yes, ma'am" was a veil. Each bow of her head was a mask. Beneath it, the weight of her decision grew heavier, but her heart grew lighter. For the first time since her child's death, she felt something other than grief. She felt direction. Abigail did not imagine freedom. Freedom was too distant, too easily stolen. She imagined balance. She imagined the oak table overturned, the laughter of children replaced with silence, the mistress's cruelty answered not with bowed heads, but with reckoning. She imagined their milk, the symbol of their plenty, turned bitter in their throats. The weeks passed like rehearsals. She poured milk each day, her movements practiced, her hands trained never to tremble. She tested her herbs in tiny doses, watching, waiting. No one suspected. No one asked why she lingered longer near the kitchen door, why she crushed dried leaves between her fingers before sweeping them away. She had become invisible, the role the Harrisons always wanted her to play. They mistook invisibility for emptiness. They did not know it could also mean preparation. When she looked at herself in the warped silver she polished, she saw no longer the humiliated girl of the dining hall. She saw someone else forming, someone quiet, patient, deliberate. Someone carrying the memory of a child buried too soon, the sting of milk poured in mockery, the ache of barefoot winters. That someone did not cry, that someone waited. The house hummed with holiday preparations. Carriages were expected, guests invited. The table set to gleam under candlelight. Songs would be sung, wine poured, prayers spoken over meat and pies. And when the mistress raised her cup of milk, as she always did, Abigail would be there, her hands steady, her face still, her silence deeper than any prayer. And in that silence, justice would begin. December 24th, 1844, the Harrison house glowed like a beacon in the frost. Lanterns burned along the veranda, windows blazed with candlelight, and smoke curled richly from the chimneys. To passers-by on the road, it looked like prosperity, like southern gentility wrapped in holly and hymn. But to those who lived beneath its roof as possessions, it was a stage for cruelty, dressed in song. The day had been long with preparations. Abigail had scrubbed the great hall until her knees ached, polished silver until her fingers cramped, carried firewood until her back throbbed. She moved silently among the chaos of servants scurrying to and fro. Mrs. Harrison oversaw every detail, her voice sharp as she demanded perfection. Garlands straight, napkins folded, glasses spotless. "We must show them our order," she said, meaning not just the house but the people inside it. Order meant obedience. Order meant power. As dusk fell, guests arrived in carriages that gleamed with brass. Boots stamped snow from their heels, laughter spilled into the halls, cloaks were removed and handed carelessly to enslaved hands. The oak table was laid heavy with food roast goose, venison, candied fruits, pies spiced with cinnamon. Crystal glasses glittered like ice, filled with wine that caught the light. Songs rose from the parlor where fiddles played and voices sang carols of peace on earth. But peace did not live here. Abigail carried the silver pitcher of milk as she always did, her hands wrapped around its cool sides. To anyone watching, she was the obedient girl, silent, bowed, steady. But inside, the storm she had nurtured for weeks pressed against her chest. The herbs she had gathered, ground and measured with such care now rested invisibly within the white liquid. The line between life and death lay thin as silk, and she carried it with calm precision. The children were the first to demand it. They reached for their cups with greedy fingers, giggling as they called her name. "Milk, girl, fill it high." Their laughter rang in her ears, echoing against memories of bread crusts thrown, spoiled milk poured over her head, a baby buried without a name. Her hands did not tremble. If anything, they were steadier than ever. She poured, one cup, then another, her movements graceful as if she were carrying water to an altar. The mistress watched approvingly, sipping her own portion. "See how well she serves," she remarked to a guest. "So obedient, so reliable." Abigail bowed her head in silence, though her mind roared. The master sat at the head of the table, red-faced with drink, boasting of his household. "I treat my people with Christian care," he declared, raising his glass. Around him guests nodded. None looked at the girl with the pitcher. None saw how her eyes were fixed, not on the floor, but on the milk itself, gleaming white in porcelain cups, like snow hiding a pit. The music grew louder. Laughter filled the hall. Plates clattered, knives cut through meat, glasses clinked in toasts to family and fortune. Abigail stood near the door, pitcher still in her hands, her face unreadable. She did not join the laughter. She did not move except to refill a cup. To those feasting, she was invisible, as she had always been. But invisibility was her VPN. The first cough came quietly, lost beneath the music. Then another, sharper, followed by the sound of a spoon clattering to the floor. A child's laughter broke into a choking gasp. The mistress turned, startled, as her daughter clutched at her throat, eyes wide. "What's wrong, my love?" she cried, rushing forward. Another child groaned, collapsing against the table, knocking over a goblet of red wine that spilled like blood across the cloth. Within moments the hall changed. Cheerful voices twisted into screams. Chairs scraped back violently, dishes crashed to the floor. The mistress's children writhed, their limbs jerking, their mouths frothing with cries that made the guests recoil in horror. The mistress shrieked, calling for help, her hands fluttering uselessly as she tried to cradle one child while another convulsed beside her. The guests stood in chaos. Some shouted for a doctor, some cursed at the servants, some backed toward the walls in terror. The master rose, his face pale now, his boasting silenced as panic surged through the room. His glass slipped from his hand, shattering at his feet. "What's happening?" he roared. But no answer came. Through it all, Abigail stood by the door. She did not run to the children. She did not cry out. Her hands hung calmly at her sides, no longer clutching the pitcher. Her face remained still, her eyes dark and unblinking as they swept across the scene. To her, it was not chaos but completion. The sounds of coughing and shrieking were not horror, they were balance, the echo of every insult answered at last. The mistress screamed, circling the table, calling for servants, for God, for anyone. But no prayer rose high enough. No hand could steady the twisting bodies of her children. Their cups lay overturned, milk staining the tablecloth in pale streaks, dripping to the floor like a cruel benediction. Abigail's silence was complete. She did not smile, she did not weep. She only watched. Watched as the house that had forced her to sing hymns to the beat of whips now rang with its own dissonant music, coughs, gasps, the wail of a mother who once poured spoiled milk over another woman's head for amusement. And for the first time in her life, Abigail felt no weight pressing her down. The room spun with panic, but around her there was stillness. It was as if the world had slowed, and she stood apart, watching the Harrisons choke on the very drink they had demanded. The very symbol of their plenty turned to their ruin. Every insult, every humiliation, every tear shed in silence had gathered here, in this night, in this moment. She did not move until the screams began to fade into whimpers, until the mistress collapsed over her children's bodies, until the guests stumbled from the room in horror. Only then did Abigail turn, her bare feet soundless against the stone floor. She left the pitcher behind on the table, silver gleaming, white liquid still pooling at its mouth. The music had stopped, the laughter was gone. Only silence remained, and Abigail walked into it, steady, invisible no longer. Newspapers called it madness, the court hissed savagery. But on the plantation, in doorways where smoke curled and eyes learned to speak without words, people whispered justice. The Harrison house dimmed for months, wreaths browned, silver dulled, a silence settled in the dining room where laughter had been sharpened into a blade. Milk cups were stored away like relics that had bitten their own priests. They said Abigail did not flee. She returned the pitcher to the sideboard, rinsed her hands in the scullery basin, and walked out into the night air as if leaving a church that had finally confessed. In the quarters, women touched her sleeve and then withdrew, frightened of what holiness might cost. Old men nodded once, slow, as though a ledger deep under the floorboards had turned a page. The Harrisons clothed their grief in prayer, then in accusation. A magistrate rode out, a doctor sniffed at cups and clucked about contamination, bad storage, negligence. No one spoke the word balance. No one wrote that the mistress had poured spoiled milk over a young woman's head, that the master made hymns a soundtrack to pain. Paper does not publish the temperature of a stone floor in December or the weight of a baby buried without a name. Abigail was taken to town in a wagon with high rails. She sat upright. She would not bow. The jail smelled of damp straw and old arguments. They offered her a minister. She looked past him, beyond brick and iron, to where cotton rows met a sky too large to own. At trial, the room filled with faces accustomed to being the audience of their own righteousness. She met none of their eyes. She did not plead. She did not decorate the truth with fear. The verdict arrived like everything else in their world, prearranged, ornate, and empty. What remained could have ended in a rope and a final spectacle. Some say it did. They swear they saw a shape on the gallows at dawn. Others say the jail burned by accident, and she walked out through smoke like a figure in a tale that refuses to end. The record book offers numbers, not certainty. But on the plantation, certainty wore another face, a memory that would not be auctioned. In the quarters, names travelled softly, Samuel's mother in the rice swamps, Louisa at a sewing bench, Esther by a winter hearth, other women who learned how silence can become a blade. Children listened, wide-eyed, as elders folded Abigail into the fabric of warnings and prayers. Do not taunt the quiet, do not mock the barefoot girl. You do not know what her hands have measured in the dark. The Harrison estate never quite recovered. Guests hesitated at invitations that promised order. Servants in other houses refused to drink what they had not poured. Milk turned suspect across the county, and masters began to taste fear in sweetness. In ledger margins, overseers scratched new rules no scripture could sanctify. Who touched the cups? Who watched the kitchen door? Who slept near the pantry key? The big houses tightened their rituals like collars. The collars only taught breath to move more quietly. Abigail did not seek freedom. She sought balance. That was the phrase that survived her name, spoken carefully by those who had stood in rooms where voices were currency and found themselves poor. Balance, not a miracle, not revenge for its own heat, but the correction of a scale that had been lied to for years. In that telling, she was not a ghost or a devil, she was the weight finally placed on the honest side. Years later, when winter thinned the world and church bells shivered in the air, some swore they heard another sound beneath the hymn porcelain touching porcelain, a pitcher set gently down. In kitchens, women lifted their cups and paused, feeling a steadiness enter their hands. In fields, men straightened when the wind carried the faint, clean bite of frost. Somewhere beyond the fence line, a girl's bare feet touched warm earth at last. What the newspapers printed faded. What the court proclaimed cracked like old plaster. But the whisper lasted, travelling the road between quarters and kitchens, crossing borders that maps could not see. It said, "Remember the stone floor. Remember the spoiled bowl. Remember the child. And if the world one day asks why the quiet are dangerous, answer with her name."